The sky over New York cracked open like an egg, and out of the fire poured death itself. Commander Vexel Devon Collective watched from a bridge of his flagship, the Dorvetha's Wrath, as beams of blue plasma lanced down to the clouds and turned Manhattan's skyline into a field of smoking craters. Beside him, his second-in-command, a wiry officer named Threll, allowed himself the ghost of a smile. 712 worlds, Vexel said quietly, watching the fire spread. 712, and not one of them lasted longer than 3 days before the surrender flags went up. He turned his 4 amber eyes toward the viewport. This one will be no different. He was wrong. The Vaughn Collective had crossed the stars for 2,000 years, absorbing world after world into their empire with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Their fleets were older than human civilization itself, their weapons capable of boiling oceans, their strategies refined across 100 conquered species, but all, eventually, knelt. Earth's governments fell within 6 hours. Its armies, its air forces, its navies, all of it evaporated under the weight of technology that outclassed anything humanity had ever built. By the second day, Vexel declared the invasion a formality. By the third, he ordered the collars prepared, the same restraint devices that had pacified a dozen other conquered species. Nobody came to wear them. Instead, in the rubble of Chicago, a power line repairman named Marcus Webb rigged a substation transformer to overload and took out an entire Vaughn patrol convoy with a blast of raw current. In the hills outside Nairobi, a retired schoolteacher organized 300 villagers into a supply network that would feed the resistance for the next 4 years. In the flooded streets of Jakarta, teenagers who had grown up gaming clan tactics turned Vaughn patrol routes into ambush corridors within a week. There was no single order given. No unified command structure sprang into being overnight. Humanity simply, collectively, refused. Sergeant Owen Davis was not a hero when the invasion began. He was 34 years old, an Army mechanic stationed outside Fort Bragg, and when the first ships broke atmosphere, he was elbow-deep in a Humvee engine, cursing a strip boat. He watched the sky burn from a hangar doorway, watched the base's air defense network go dark in less than 90 seconds, and felt something in his chest that wasn't fear so much as a cold, clarifying fury. "They think we're just going to lie down," he said to no one in particular. Within a month, Owen had gathered 11 survivors from his unit and turned an abandoned quarry into a hideout. Within 3 months, that 11 had become 60. He had no formal command, no orders from any surviving government. Most of those had gone silent in the first week, but people started calling him Sergeant anyway, and then just a sergeant, and the name stuck like a brand. It was in the 4th month that he met Dr. Elena Vasquez. She arrived at the quarry half-starved, dragging a reinforced case that she refused to let anyone else carry, escorted by 2 of Owen's scouts who found her sabotaging a Vaughn supply depot with what looked like a homemade EMP charge. She was 31, a former astrophysicist who'd been consulting for the Pentagon since vaporized Enology Division, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel like a problem she was already 3 steps toward solving. "You're the one they call the sergeant," she said, sizing him up in the flickering light of a scavenged lantern. "Depends who's asking. Someone who's found something in their communications traffic that you need to see." She set the case down and opened it, revealing a tangle of scavenged electronics and a cracked Vaughn data core. "I've been intercepting their command chatter for 6 weeks. Most of it's logistics, troop movement, the usual, but there's a designation that keeps coming up. A protocol. They reference it like it's inevitable, like it's already decided." "What protocol?" Alina's expression didn't change, but something in her voice went very still. "Protocol 7B. Neither of them knew yet what those 2 words would come to mean. Not just for the resistance, not just for Earth, but for every species that had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if humanity was worth watching. Above them, in orbit, Commander Vexel stood in front of a star map showing 713 worlds, one of them still stubbornly, infuriatingly unconquered, and made a call to the Galactic Council that would change everything. "Command," he said, "we may have a problem." He had no idea how right he was. The first time Owen Davis led an assault on a Vaughn checkpoint, he was sure he was leading his people to their deaths. And he was almost right. 6 months into the occupation, the world had reorganized itself into something unrecognizable. Cities were still occupied, their populations herded into compliance zones ringed with energy barriers. But the countryside had become something Vaughn had never encountered before, a landscape that fought back with every tool available to it. From stolen alien plasma rifles to sharpened rebar to, in one now legendary incident outside Lyon, a farmer's combine harvester driven directly through a patrol line. Vexel's reports back to the council grew shorter and angrier with each passing week. Casualty numbers that should have been statistically impossible kept climbing. Supply convoys vanished. Garrison commanders reported troops going missing in the night, their tracking beacons found later, always empty, always mocking. "They are not a resistance," Threll said one evening, reviewing the latest losses with his commander. "A resistance has leadership, structure. Cut off the head, and the body dies. This is something else." "Then what is it?" Vexel demanded. Threll had no answer. Neither, in truth, did Owen, who found himself constantly astonished by how quickly strangers became soldiers. A retired nurse named Priya Chandra turned an abandoned rural clinic into a field hospital that saved hundreds of lives, teaching triage to teenagers who'd never held so much as a first aid kit. A 22-year-old electrician named Jamal Reeves figured out how to hack Vaughn perimeter sensors using scavenged parts and a laptop with a cracked screen, and within weeks his modified jammers were being smuggled to resistance cells on 3 continents. None of them had asked to become who they were becoming. All of them had simply decided that lying down was not an option. It was Alina who gave a movement its first real shape. She understood, better than anyone, that the Vaughn's greatest weakness was the very thing that made them so effective against other species: certainty. Every world they conquered had followed a predictable pattern. Shock, chaos, negotiation, submission. Their entire military doctrine was built on that pattern. Humanity's refusal to follow the script wasn't just inconvenient for them. It was, Alina began to suspect, something Vaughn had never truly planned for, because no species ever had. "Look at this," she said one night, spreading captured Vaughn documents across a makeshift table lit by a single lantern. Owen leaned in. Much of it was in a language his translator software rendered only partially, but certain words came through clear enough. Anomalous, unprecedented, escalation authorization requested. "They're scared," Owen said slowly. "They're more than scared." Alina tapped a section of text, her finger trembling slightly, not from fear, but from something closer to disbelief. "This isn't a field commander's report anymore. This is going to the Galactic Council directly. Vexel isn't just fighting a war down here. He's requesting authorization for something bigger. Protocol 7B. Protocol 7B. They still didn't know what it meant, but Alina had begun cross-referencing every scrap of intercepted Vaughn communication with historical accounts of other conquered worlds, and a horrifying pattern was starting to emerge. Worlds that resisted too effectively didn't just get conquered harder. Some of them, according to fragments she'd pieced together from decades-old deep space signal archives, simply stopped existing. No more transmissions. No more records. Erased from Vaughn logs, as though they had never been there at all. "You think they'd do that to Earth?" Owen said. It wasn't a question. "I think," Alina said carefully, "that the reason they invaded us in the first place might not have anything to do with resources or territory or any of the reasons they've given every other world they've conquered." She looked up at him, and in the lantern light her eyes were hard and clear. "I think they came here to test something. And I think we're failing the test in exactly the way that terrifies them most." Outside the quarry, the resistance kept growing. Farmers who'd never held a weapon in their lives learned to strip and clean a plasma rifle by firelight. Grandmothers ran supply lines through occupied territory, hiding contraband beneath aprons and grocery baskets, using the simple, devastating advantage of being underestimated. Children who should have been in school were instead learning to read the subtle signs of an approaching Vaughn patrol and passing warnings hand to hand down whole streets in under 2 minutes. They were not soldiers by training. They were teachers and mechanics and nurses and electricians, people who 3 months earlier had worried about mortgage payments and school pickups, and who now moved through occupied cities like ghosts, striking and vanishing again and again, refusing every single time to be the world that finally, quietly, gave up. Owen watched them and understood, for the first time, that this had stopped being a war for territory. It had become something else entirely, a test of what humanity actually was at its core when everything else had been stripped away. And whatever answer the Vaughn had expected to find, it was not the one currently burning their supply lines to the ground. Above the atmosphere, in the cold silence of his command bridge, Commander Vexel finally received his answer from the Galactic Council. He read it twice, his 4 eyes narrowing, before he set the datapad down. "Pharrell," he said quietly, "prepare the fleet. Full escalation is authorized." The war humanity thought it understood was about to become something far, far worse. The night the Vaughn burned the compliance zone at Denver to the ground, Owen Davis learned exactly how far Commander Vexel was willing to go, and exactly why the Resistance could never afford to lose. The attack came without warning. Full escalation, it turned out, meant abandoning the pretense of a controlled occupation entirely. Where before the Vaughn had tried to maintain the appearance of an orderly conquest, now their ships descended on suspected Resistance strongholds with indiscriminate force. Denver's compliance zone, home to nearly 40,000 civilians who had done nothing but exist under occupation, was reduced to ash in under an hour. The official Vaughn transmission that followed called it a necessary demonstration. Owen received the news at the quarry, and something in him went cold and sharp and permanent. He had lost people before, friends, fellow soldiers, a cousin who died in the first wave of the invasion, but this was different. This was a message, sent in fire, meant for every human being still breathing. Resistance has a price, and we will make you pay it. They're not trying to win anymore, Alina said, staring at the satellite feed of the smoking crater that had once been a city. Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone holding herself together through sheer discipline. They're trying to break us. Will it work? She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, Owen saw something other than analytical calm in her eyes. He saw grief, and beneath the grief, something harder. I don't think they understand what they're dealing with. I don't think they ever have. It was in the wreckage of what remained of Vaughn Command outpost outside Colorado Springs, hit by a joint resistance strike 2 days after Denver, in retaliation that Owen had authorized with a grim certainty he'd never felt before, that Alina finally cracked encryption on a data core that would change everything. She worked through the night, fueled by scavenged coffee and a desperation that had nothing to do with curiosity anymore. When she finally broke through the last layer of cryptography, she sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before she called Owen into the makeshift server room. "I need you to see this," she said. Her hands were shaking. The files were old, decades old, by Vaughn dating conventions, and they told a story that reframed everything the Resistance thought it understood about the invasion. Earth had not been targeted for its resources, as the Vaughn's public war doctrine claimed. It had not been targeted for its strategic position, or its population, or any of the practical reasons that had justified 712 previous conquests. Earth had been watched, for centuries, quietly and visibly, by Galactic Council observation drones disguised as nothing more than distant debris, cataloging humanity's wars, its plagues, its disasters, its recoveries. The files contain analysis after analysis of human behavior across historical catastrophes, the resilience of populations after devastating conflicts, the speed of technological and social recovery after collapse, patterns of cooperation and sacrifice that appeared nowhere else in 712 catalog civilizations. The conclusion, reached by Council analysts long before a single Vaughn ship entered Earth's solar system, was stark. Subject species demonstrates resilience and adaptive capacity 3 orders of magnitude beyond any previously cataloged sentient population. Threat classification, unprecedented. Recommend immediate assessment via controlled invasion scenario to determine true operational ceiling. They didn't invade us to conquer us, Owen said slowly, reading the words twice to be sure he understood them. They invaded us to test us. That's not the worst part. Alina scrolled further, and her voice dropped. Look at this designation. Right here. Protocol 7B. Containment Directive. The document that followed was clinical, bloodless, the kind of language that made the horror of it worse rather than better. If a subject species under invasion assessment demonstrated resistance capacity exceeding safe containment thresholds, resistance capacity, Owen now understood with a sick lurch in his stomach, exactly like what Earth had shown over the past 6 months. The Council authorized total eradication of the species as a threat to galactic stability, not conquest, not subjugation. Extinction, sanctioned and clean, carried out from orbit with a weapon system the files referred to only as the Cradle Breaker. Alina's hands had stopped shaking. She had gone past fear into something colder and more focused. Every world that ever fought back too well, she said. Every civilization that proved it couldn't be controlled. This is what happened to them. This is why there's no record of them anywhere. The Vaughn didn't just conquer 712 worlds. Owen, they erased however many more decided they'd rather die fighting than live as slaves. Owen thought of Denver, of Chicago and Nairobi and Jakarta, and every quarry and basement and rural hideout scattered across a planet that had refused, from the very first hour, to kneel. He thought of Marcus Webb and the substation, of Priya Chandra's field hospital, of Jamal Reeves hacking sensor networks with a cracked laptop screen, of 100,000 ordinary people who had simply decided that giving up was not who they were. "How long do we have?" he asked. Alina checked the timestamp on the most recent file, cross-referenced it against orbital positioning data she'd been quietly tracking for weeks, and felt the last of her composure threaten to give way. The Cradle Breaker requires deployment authorization from a full Vaughn command fleet in orbital position. Vexel requested escalation authorization 3 days ago. She looked up at him. "I think Denver wasn't demonstration. Owen, I think Denver was the last data point they needed. Somewhere above them, in the cold dark of Earth's own sky, the instrument of humanity's extinction was already moving into position. 3 days. That was all the time humanity had left, and Owen Davis spent the first of them doing something he'd never imagined he'd be capable of, convincing hundreds of scattered, independent resistance cells across 6 continents that their only chance of survival was to stop fighting separately and start fighting as one. It should have been impossible. The resistance had grown organically, cell by cell, city by city, each group led by whoever had stepped up when the world fell apart. A schoolteacher in Kenya, a fisherman-turned-tactician in the Philippines, a grandmother running supply lines who occupied Warsaw, a coalition of former Special Forces operators hiding in the Australian outback. They had no shared chain of command, no unified communication network, no reason to trust a mechanic from North Carolina who claimed to have proof that the entire planet was about to be erased from existence. Alina solved the first problem. Working with Jamal Reeves and a growing team of scavenger engineers, she adapted the same jamming technology that had been disrupting Vaughn's sensors into something new, a low-frequency relay network, bounced between modified ham radio rigs and hijacked Vaughn communication satellites, capable of reaching resistance cells that had been operating in total isolation for months. It wasn't fast. It wasn't elegant. But it worked. The message Owen recorded went out in 17 languages, translated by volunteers working in shifts through the night, and it was simple, brutal, and true. They didn't come here for our resources. They came here to test us. And because we refuse to break, they're going to erase us. We have 3 days. After that, it won't matter how brave we were, or how many of them we killed, or how long we held out, because there won't be an Earth left for anyone to remember it on. I'm not asking you to trust me because I have rank, because I don't have any, or because I have proof, though we do. I'm asking you to trust me because you already know, in your gut, that this fight was never about winning small battles in your own backyard. It was always about this. All of it, together, or none of it at all. The response, when it came, humbled him. Within 18 hours, resistance leaders from 43 countries had responded to the relay network. Some with skepticism, most with a grim recognition of people who had already suspected something like this was coming. The schoolteacher from Kenya, a woman named Amara Odieno who had turned her entire district into a self-sufficient resistance stronghold, sent back a single line that Owen would remember for the rest of his life. "We did not survive this long to die quietly. Tell us where to be. Building a coordinated assault against an orbital command fleet, using nothing but scavenge human technology and capture Vaughn hardware, should have taken months of planning that they did not have. Instead, it took 36 hours of the most intense, desperate collaboration humanity had ever undertaken. Engineers and Seoul working alongside hackers in Sao Paulo, former Air Force pilots in the American Midwest coordinating flight paths with resistance cells that had captured and reverse-engineered 3 functioning Vaughn dropships. Physicists in a bunker beneath what remained of Geneva, calculating the precise orbital mechanics, needed to get a fleet of jury-rigged launch vehicles into, positioned to strike the Vaughn's primary command platform before the cradle breaker could be authorized for deployment. Alina barely slept. She ran the numbers obsessively, refining the strike plan again and again, aware that a single miscalculation could doom not just the mission, but the species. Owen found her at 4 a.m. on the second day, hunched over a bank of scavenged monitors, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "You need to rest," he said. "I need this to work," she replied, not looking up. "There's a difference." He sat down beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Outside, the quarry that had become their home for the better part of a year buzzed with energy that hadn't been there before. Hope, sharpened into something almost unbearable by the knowledge of how much was riding on the next 24 hours. "Can I ask you something?" Owen said finally. "Ask. Do you think we deserve this? What they said about us, the resilience, the adaptability, all of it. Do you think it's true?" Alina considered the question longer than he expected. "I think," she said slowly, "that every single person out there fighting right now could have surrendered, could have decided the fight wasn't worth it, that survival mattered more than resistance. Almost every one of them has lost someone. Almost every one of them has had 100 good reasons to give up." She finally looked at him, and something in her exhausted face was almost like wonder. "And they didn't. Not because they thought they'd win. Most of them probably still think they won't. They kept fighting because giving up was never actually an option. I don't know if that's resilience, or stubbornness, or love, or all three at once. But whatever the council saw in us, Owen, I think they were right to be afraid of it." By the end of the second day, humanity had assembled something that had never existed before in the history of the species. A single, unified strike force, drawn from every continent, every culture, every background imaginable, united by nothing more than a shared refusal to disappear quietly. Farmers who'd never left their home countries found themselves coordinating with Interpol fugitives and retired generals and teenage hackers, all working toward the same impossible goal. Above them, unaware of the storm gathering beneath his fleet, Commander Vexel finalized the last authorization codes for the Cradle Breaker's deployment sequence, confident that whatever remained of human resistance would be nothing more than a footnote in the Council's final report. He had 1 day left to be wrong about that. 2. 0 hour arrived with silence that felt heavier than any explosion. At the quarry, and in 100 other hidden bases scattered across the planet, humanity's last coordinated act of defiance began not with battle cry, but with the quiet, methodical work of people who understood exactly what they were about to risk. Owen Davis stood in the pale gray light of dawn, watching engineers make final checks on 3 captured Vaughn dropships. Vessels that resisted cells across 3 continents had spent months secretly disassembling, studying, and rebuilding with a patchwork of alien and human technology that Alina privately doubted should have worked at all. "Talk to me," Owen said, watching her run a final diagnostic on the lead ship's navigation system. "They'll fly," she said. "Whether they'll survive contact with Vaughn Command Platform's point defense grid is a different question entirely." She looked up at him, and for a moment the mask of clinical focus slipped, just slightly. "This is insane, Owen. You know that. 3 modified dropships and whatever hardware we've managed to scrape together against a fleet that conquered 712 worlds. 712 worlds that gave up." Owen said, "We're not going to." The plan, refined across 2 sleepless days by minds that had never worked together before and would likely never work together again, was audacious in its simplicity. While the 3 modified dropships, crewed by volunteers who understood that perhaps a coin flip's chance of returning alive, made a direct run at the Vaughn Command Platform's primary reactor core, coordinated ground assaults would erupt simultaneously in every major occupied city on the planet, forcing the Vaughn to divide their attention between an orbital threat they'd never anticipated and a planetary uprising too widespread to contain. It wasn't a plan built on the expectation of victory. It was a plan built on the certainty that doing nothing guaranteed extinction, and doing something, however desperate, at least gave humanity a fighting chance to determine its own fate. Amara Odieno led the ground assault in Nairobi, her forces striking the Compliance Zone's command center with a coordinated precision that stunned the garrison commander stationed there. In Sao Paulo, hackers and street fighters worked in tandem to seize control of an entire Vaughn communications relay, plunging local Vaughn forces into chaos and confusion at the exact moment they needed clear orders most. In city after city, across time zones and languages and cultures that had never before moved with a single purpose, humanity rose at once, and the Vaughn occupation forces, trained for 100 conquests that had followed predictable patterns of gradual submission, found themselves facing something their doctrine had no answer for, a planet that fought back everywhere, all at once, with a coordination that should not have been possible from a species they had crushed within the first 72 hours of invasion. Above the atmosphere, Commander Vexel received the reports of planet-wide uprising with rising, unfamiliar dread. "This is not possible," he said, watching casualty projections spike across every occupied region simultaneously. "They have no command structure, no central authority. How is this coordinated?" Threll, watching sensor readings with growing alarm, had no answer for him. Not until the first alert flashed across the command platform's threat display. 3 unidentified vessels, moving with impossible speed on an intercept vector toward the platform's primary reactor core. "Impossible," Vexel said again, but this time the word came out as something closer to fear. The battle that followed would be remembered, in whatever fragmented histories humanity managed to preserve of that day, as the moment the war truly turned. Owen rode in the lead dropship alongside 4 volunteers, a former fighter pilot from Israel, an aerospace engineer from India, a mechanic from Detroit, and a 19-year-old drone specialist from Manila who had lied about her age to be there, as Von Point Defense fire tore through the space around them, close enough to feel the shock waves through the ship's hull. 30 seconds to reactor approach, the pilot shouted over the chaos. Alina's voice crackled through the ship's comm system from her makeshift command post at the quarry, where she was coordinating the strike alongside dozens of other resistance leaders across the planet. "Owen, their point of fence grid is adapting to your flight pattern. You need to break formation now, or you won't make it to the drop point." "Copy that." Owen looked at the 4 people beside him. Strangers 3 days earlier, bound now by something that felt less like military discipline and more like family. "You all know what happens if this doesn't work." "We know," the pilot said grimly. "Let's make it work, then." They broke formation exactly as the Vaughn defense grid adjusted to intercept their previous trajectory, buying precious seconds as plasma fire tore harmlessly through empty space where they should have been. The second dropship wasn't so fortunate. Owen watched, his chest tightening with a grief he had no time to process, as it took a direct hit and spiraled away from the formation, its crew's fate unknown. There was no time to mourn. There was only the reactor core, growing larger in the viewport, and the desperate, narrowing window in which humanity's entire future will be decided. "Deploying charges," the engineer called out, her hand steady despite everything. Below, on the surface of a planet fighting for its life in 100 cities at once, Amara Odiano watched the sky over Nairobi and whispered something that felt less like a prayer and more like a promise. Not today. Not ever. In orbit, Commander Vexel finally understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to save him, exactly what kind of species he had chosen to invade. The reactor charges detonated with a silence that only made sense in the vacuum of space. No sound, just a sudden, blinding bloom of light that swallowed the Vaughn command platform's core section whole, and for one suspended, terrible moment, Owen Davis didn't know if he was watching victory or his own death arriving at last. The shock wave hit the dropship a heartbeat later, spinning it violently off its escape trajectory. Alarm screamed through the cabin. Somewhere behind him, the drone specialist from Manila was shouting damage reports that Owen could barely process through the ringing in his ears, and for several long seconds the only thing he was certain was that they were still alive, still tumbling through the wreckage-strewn dark, and that below them, impossibly, the platform's massive silhouette was breaking apart against the black backdrop of space. Hull integrity failing, the pilot barked, wrestling the controls. "We need to get clear before secondary explosions." The rest of the sentence was lost as a section of collapsing command platform tore past them close enough to feel, and then, somehow, they were through, clear of the debris field, watching from a safe distance as a platform that housed the cradle breaker, the weapon built to erase humanity from existence without a second thought, came apart in a slow, silent cascade of fire and twisted metal. On the surface, the effect was immediate and electric. Vaughn ground forces, suddenly cut off from Central Command and reeling from the loss of their primary orbital platform, began falling into disarray. In Nairobi, Amara Otieno watched Vaughn patrol units abandon their positions entirely, retreating towards secondary landing zones in a panic that resistance fighters who had endured a year of brutal occupation were more than happy to exploit. In Sao Paulo, in Warsaw, in Manila and Detroit, and 100 other cities that had spent months learning to survive under occupation, the same story repeated itself. An enemy that had built its entire doctrine on overwhelming, centralized force suddenly finding itself scattered, leaderless, and afraid. Commander Vexel survived the destruction of his command platform by a matter of minutes, evacuating aboard a secondary vessel with Threll and a skeleton crew, watching from a shuttle viewport as everything he believed about the inevitability of Vaughn conquest burned behind him. When the surviving Vaughn fleet finally regrouped days later, badly mauled and facing a planet in full, coordinated revolt, the order that came down from what remained a Council command was not for reinforcement. It was for withdrawal. The Galactic Council, Alina would later learn from intercepted transmissions in the weeks that followed, had spent decades preparing for the possibility that Earth might prove too dangerous to control. What they had never prepared for was the possibility that Earth might prove too dangerous to destroy, either that a full withdrawal, rather than a genocidal escalation, might be the only option that didn't risk drawing the attention of species that had, in the span of a single year, gone from a world with no unified government to a planet capable of coordinating a successful strike against an interstellar command fleet. Owen returned to the surface 3 days after the battle, exhausted, grieving the crew of the second dropship who had not survived, but alive in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after a year of simply enduring. He found Alina at the quarry, surrounded by resistance leaders from a dozen countries who had traveled, in the chaotic days following the Vaughn withdrawal, to meet in person for the first time. Faces that had existed for months only as voices over a scavenged radio relay, now standing together in the same room. "They're really leaving," Owen said, still not quite able to believe it. "They're really leaving," Alina confirmed, "though I doubt this is over." "Not really. A species that watched us for centuries before deciding to invade isn't going to just walk away and forget we exist." She managed a tired, genuine smile. "But for now, yes, we survived." In the months that followed, as humanity began the long, difficult work of rebuilding what the occupation had destroyed, something unexpected began to filter through the wreckage of Vaughn communication networks that resistance intelligence teams continued to monitor. Word of Earth's rebellion had spread, not just through Vaughn command channels, but further into the wider Galactic Council itself, where representatives of other species, some of them survivors of conquests far more brutal and complete than anything Earth had endured, began asking quiet, careful questions about the world that had refused to fall. A year after the battle, a Council envoy arrived in Earth's orbit, not with an invasion fleet, but with a single unarmed vessel, requesting, for the first time in the planet's history, formal contact rather than conquest. Owen Davis, no longer just a sergeant, but the reluctant, unifying face of a planet that had fought his way to a seat at a table that had never asked to sit at, stood beside Alina Vasquez and Amara Otieno and dozens of other resistance leaders from every corner of the world, and watched as humanity took its first step into a galaxy that had finally, grudgingly, learned to see it not as prey, but as something else entirely. "You are aware," the envoy said carefully, through a translator that hummed with quiet uncertainty, "that your species has become a subject of considerable discussion across the Council. Some believe you represent an existential threat that should never have been allowed to survive contact. And what do you believe?" Owen asked. The envoy considered the question for a long moment. "I believe," she said finally, "that a species capable of destruction on the scale you demonstrated, and yet choosing in your moment of victory to rebuild rather than retaliate, to extend a hand to the very forces that try to erase you, is not a threat at all. I believe you may be something my own people have not seen in a very long time." She paused. Hope. Earth did not enter the galactic community as a conquered world, nor as a conqueror in its own right. It entered as something the Vaughn Collective, in 712 prior invasions, had never once encountered, an equal, forged not by superior weapons or overwhelming technology, but by an unbreakable, collective refusal to be anything less than what it chose to be. Humanity's greatest weapon, The galaxy would come to learn in the decades that followed had never been its capacity for war. It was something far rarer and far more dangerous to anyone foolish enough to test it, an unimaginable determination, tempered always by an equally unimaginable compassion, that together proved impossible to conquer and impossible to ignore. The species once dismissed as primitive had become the galaxy's greatest hope, and it had done so not by refusing to fight, but by refusing, in the deepest and most human sense of the word, to ever stop caring for one another, no matter the cost.